looking specifically at America, which in many ways is where I think the dimensions of this of white guilt become maybe their clearest. In 1964, we passed a Civil Rights Bill in the United States. In 1965, we passed the Voting Rights Act. Both of these acts, and I think they are some of the greatest social legislation ever passed anywhere in the world, ever written anywhere in the world. They're the model for other such legislation around the world. And inherent in this legislation was the acknowledgement on the part of America that it had done something very wrong, that racism was wrong, that slavery was wrong, that segregation was wrong, that white supremacy itself was wrong. I think this was America's greatest moment. Here was a nation that morally came to terms with itself, faced itself. I'm not aware of this. Maybe it has happened, but I'm not aware of it anywhere else in the world before this happening, where a society rich and powerful looks at itself, examines itself in the way that America did at that period in time, and makes the decision to change and acknowledges the wrong and vows to become a different kind of society. And so America has to be applauded. I'm glad to be in America because America was able to do that. It would have been very difficult if America had not been able to do that. The problem, though, as always happens in human affairs, when you acknowledge a wrong, you say, yes, okay, it was wrong, and we're going to move away from that. The price you pay is that you lose your moral authority. And I think this is, again, one of the most important events in American history, that given after the Civil Rights Movement, Americans, white Americans, but more importantly than individuals, our institutions lost a considerable amount of moral authority, because now blacks and other minorities could say, well, by your own acknowledgement, you're admitting that that America did us wrong.
What's up, YouTube family? Welcome back to my space. This is Evans Rayola. Guys, thank you so much for tuning to watch this episode. I do not take your support for granted. So far, on today's video, we want to talk about white guilt and how it has affected the promise of the civil rights. So to speak to us today is Shelby Still, who is a conservative Black American author and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, often critiques liberalism, race-based identity politics, and what he calls white guilt in his writings and public appearances. Still argues that white guilt is undermining the principles and the promise of Western civilization, including individual rights, personal responsibility, and meritocracy. Some of the key insights on the white guilt by Shelby Still have always been how white guilt harms civilization, and it's right. First and foremost, the first question is, what is white guilt? Still defines white guilt as the moral vulnerability white people feel due to history of slave, segregation, and racism. It's not guilt over personal acts of racism, but over being associated with a history of oppression. White guilt is the vacuum of moral authority that comes from simply knowing that one's race is associated with racism. So family, I want you to listen to this conversation keenly, as Still discusses white guilt and how it has affected the promise, of civilization. Once the video is done, we will get back and do a critical analysis about the same. Let's watch this together, family.
My current book is White Guilt, title, and it's an attempt to sort of look at what seems to me to be a really important phenomenon, certainly in American life, if not if it doesn't extend beyond that, I think maybe to much of the Western world. And nobody else was writing about it, so it seemed to me that that's what a writer's looking for, is new territory. So I'll just talk about that for a little while. I don't want to give you a whole full-blown technical lecture here and put everybody to sleep. So what I'd like to do is just talk about it for a little while, then we'll open it up for questions and have a conversation. It begins, it seems to me, in a phenomenon that I think, at any rate, is one of the most important events, certainly in late 20th century history. I think even more important than the collapse of communism that happened in the 80s. And that is the collapse or the delegitimization, to use the long, awkward word, of white supremacy. And it's interesting to me that this phenomenon has gone unremarked, uncommented on in many ways. But white supremacy was an enormously important force, idea, in the world for centuries, and organized the entire globe and extended the nation-state system from one end of the world to the other. So its mark will never leave the world, and it gave a coherence to the world. And the important thing, I think, to understand about white supremacy is not whether or not it really is an argument for the supremacy of whites or the inferiority of other races. But what was important about it was the idea that whiteness constituted, in and of itself, moral authority. And so that if a black man in Africa met a white man on a path somewhere and there was no one around within 50 miles, the black man would have to carry the white man's bags, because whiteness was authority, and thus it was power. And so whites then could very, given that authority, could very reasonably go around the world and take over whatever territories they desired, and to take whatever resources they desired, and to then sort of corral the people into some sort of servitude, if it so suited them. Well, so you see, it was a really powerful, enormously powerful idea that gave a certain meaning to life in the world. After World War II, there began to be revolutions from one end of the globe to the other. There was a revolution in India that was passive. There were revolutions all across Africa, all across the Middle East, all across Asia. Some of these revolutions were violent. The Algerian Revolution was a particularly violent one. Some of them were pacifistic. India, the American Civil Rights Revolution was just one of many. It was one, thankfully, that was also nonviolent. Some were communist, again nationalistic. But in any case, what I think all of them were, in one way or another, revolutions against not the idea of white supremacy. They sort of left that argument aside, but against the authority. And they succeeded. Western powers retreated everywhere in the world. Britain, France drew back from their colonies. The civil rights movement in America was victorious, so that the idea that whiteness in and of itself constituted authority was defeated, was killed off. There are no serious people today, anywhere in the world, who stand forth in the public square and argue for that whites ought to rule the world, that white supremacy is a valid idea. Doesn't mean that people don't believe in the idea of white supremacy. Doesn't mean that all racism is gone. But the authority that was once inherent in white supremacy has been defeated. And I think it has had a profound effect on the world. Certainly it has also had a profound effect here in America. Looking specifically at America, which in many ways is where I think the dimensions of this of white guilt become maybe they're clearest. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Bill in the United States. In 1965, we passed the Voting Rights Act. Both of these acts, I think they are some of the greatest social legislation ever passed anywhere in the world, ever written anywhere in the world. They're the model for other such legislation around the world. And inherent in this legislation was the acknowledgement on the part of America that it had done something very wrong, that racism was wrong, that slavery was wrong, that segregation was wrong, that white supremacy itself was wrong. I think this was America's greatest moment. Here was a nation that morally came to terms with itself, faced itself. I'm not aware of this, maybe it has happened, but I'm not aware of it anywhere else in the world before this happening, where a society, rich and powerful, looks at itself, examines itself in the way that America did at that period in time, and makes the decision to change and acknowledges the wrong and vows to become a different kind of society. And so America has to be applauded. I'm glad to be in America because America was able to do that. It would have been very difficult if America had not been able to do that. The problem, though, as always happens in human affairs, when you acknowledge a wrong, you say, yes, okay, it was wrong, and we're going to move away from that. The price you pay is that you lose your moral authority. And I think this is, again, one of the most important events in American history, that given after the Civil Rights Movement, Americans, white Americans, but more importantly than individuals, our institutions lost a considerable amount of moral authority, because now blacks and other minorities could say, well, by your own acknowledgement, you're admitting that that America did us wrong. And so the moral authority that whites lost shifted to minorities and became an important source of power for minorities. As I've said, black power is, white guilt is black power. It's the same, they are the same phenomenon. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when I look at specifically how blacks responded to this. So white guilt then is not a guilt of conscience. It's not, I can't sleep at night because I'm so guilty about what happened to black Americans before I was born. It's not that kind. If white guilt was that, then we wouldn't be here today talking about this phenomenon. But it is this vacuum of moral authority, this not having the authority to be able to speak about any number of issues, race, poverty, and so forth, because of having acknowledged this past, the sins of the past. White guilt is enforced by stigma. When you acknowledge that you were a part of a group, that you belong to a group that did a wrong in the past. Think, if you want to, I think, see this in vivid terms, think of the Germans after World War II. The stigma of having been a Nazi, having a Nazi in your family, an uncle who was whatever. Well, you might not, you might yourself not have been a Nazi, might never have subscribed to that point of view. But outside of Germany, all Germans, in a sense, became, from then on, stigmatized by the sin of Nazism. And other people could look at them and have a certain, again, moral authority in relation to them. Well, in many ways, I think that's what happened in America. Whites became stigmatized as racist. And from that point on, whites are in the position of forever having to prove the negative, that they're not a racist. Again, if they don't prove the negative, then the stigma sticks. Well, you must be a racist. And so since that time, whites, and particularly, again, our institutions, have lived under threat of stigmatization. Why is that important? It's important because if you are stigmatized as a racist in American society, if an institution, let's say, it's easier, I think, to see on an institutional level, then that institution becomes illegitimate. It loses its legitimacy. It loses its ability to really function in the society. So the stigma has a powerful impact because it has so much control over the legitimacy. How can you be a legitimate institution in a multiracial society that is supposed to be free and everyone is supposed to be equal under the law? How can you be legitimate if you don't have any blacks in your institution? So we could look at a disparity like that. Blacks could, again, moral authority having passed to us, we could look at a disparity like that and we could say, you don't have any blacks in your institution, it's a racist institution, it's illegitimate, we will sue it, we will do whatever it takes. And in a sense, since the 60s, that's pretty much what has happened, is that minorities have begun to sort of manipulate that stigma. And so we call it in some circles today the race card. We play the race card. What does the race card mean? Well, if you don't do what I want you to do, then you're going to be stigmatized as a racist, and the price you'll pay is you'll lose your legitimacy. So white guilt is a powerful force. Not because people feel guilty, but because people are stigmatized, and again have to prove the negative all the time, and for living forever under threat of being stigmatized. This leads to the next phenomenon that is a feature of white guilt, and that's dissociation. The only way to get away from the stigma of being a racist is to find some way to dissociate oneself from the stigma, from the image that you are a racist, that you are like the whites of old, that you still secretly are a white supremacist, that you still secretly believe in this, that your heart is, that you may be smiling, but your heart is still committed to racism. And so, again, whites walking around under this sort of cloud of suspicion then have to find ways to dissociate themselves from that. I think the first great example of dissociation in American life was President Johnson's Great Society. Why all of a sudden, in 1965, do you just say, well, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars, we're going to create all kinds of social programs, and we're going to dump all this money on, and we're going to end poverty in our time. You create all these programs, almost all of which failed. Certainly they did not eradicate poverty. They did not bring about racial equality. They did virtually nothing. But they did dissociate the American society and the American government from the stigma of racism. The federal government had just, by its own legislation, acknowledged that it had been racist. That was too much moral authority for minorities to have. And the government really had to do something dramatic because the sin had been so dramatic. the wrong had been so dramatic and had gone on for so long and had so clearly violated the principles of a free society that America had to do something big and huge, had to spend a lot of money to say, in effect, we're not like that anymore. We're not that old America that discriminated and oppressed people. We're a new America. And we're going to even get rid of poverty. We're going to wipe it out from the human condition. So it wasn't that the Great Society was actually going to, the purpose of the Great Society was not actually to end poverty or achieve racial equality. It was to restore some legitimacy to the American government, to the American society. I remember that time very well. I was in college in those years, and as much as I disagree with the Great Society, as terrible as it was, as wasteful as it was, as destructive as it was, I can remember feeling that I was not going to recognize my own government if it didn't do something, if it didn't make some gesture. I'd be happy to tell it what kind at this point, but it didn't. It certainly didn't make the right one, and I was a part of it. Not that back in those days, but it had to do something. President Johnson, there were riots from one end of America to the other. Los Angeles burned up, New York, Newark, Detroit. Huge riots, destructive riots, many deaths, much property damage. And it looked as though blacks were simply no longer going to identify with America as their nation. Militant groups began to spring up everywhere. Cultural nationalists, the Black Panthers, right up the road here in Oakland, with no longer with nonviolent passive resistance, now with guns. And ready to have shootouts with the police and so forth. So the president knew there had to be something huge to dissociate the United States government from the past, to say we're not like that anymore. We're a different America. Well, my feeling is that almost all of the racial policy since the Great Society, since 1965, has been designed not to solve racial problems, but to dissociate our institutions and our government from its racist past, and to restore moral authority and legitimacy to the government. You see, for example, a few years ago in the affirmative action case, the Michigan case that was decided, there were 100 briefs were submitted to the Supreme Court in favor of racial preferences by every imaginable American institution, from corporations to city governments, even the military submitted a brief. You notice there was no march on Washington in favor of affirmative action by blacks, by black people or other minorities, nothing. But this extraordinary pressure from America's institutions arguing that the Supreme Court ought to allow racial preferences to stay in place. Well, again, why? I think the reason is because those institutions are saying, look, we are under a stigma. Our legitimacy is at stake here. We have to have a way to prove, to indicate that we're not like that anymore, that we're not an exclusive, racist institution. We are an open, inclusive, that's the new word, inclusive institution that wants everybody in our midst. And so we have to have diversity policies, and we have to be able to bring in minorities so that they're here, because again, our entire legitimacy depends on it. Harvard University, Stanford University, all of the Ivy League have to have about 8% of every single freshman class be black. Has to be. Not 7, not 6, but at least 8. Probably without racial preferences, about 1 to 2% of every freshman class would be black. So the rest, the 7%, are the result of racial preferences. I've written a lot about how the negative effects I think that has on minorities. I think one of the cruelest things a society can do is to take the best and the brightest young black Americans and basically say to them, you simply cannot compete with the best and brightest of other races. We won't allow you to do that. You can't do it. You have to depend on our paternalism. Well, what a cruel thing to do to a group that's trying to overcome 4 centuries of oppression. But does the administration at Harvard or Stanford or Yale or Princeton or any of those schools care about the impact that they're having on black students, the way they're stigmatizing them as second-raters? Even that 1 or 2% who would have gotten into that institution anyway? They say, look, we have to have 8% blacks in our freshman class. We don't care about you because that our whole legitimacy, the legitimacy of our institution depends on that. If we go down to 1 or 2%, then we are going to be stigmatized as a racist university. Faculty won't want to come here. We will lose money. We will lose grants. Our institution will decline in its whole. We will lose our reputation in every way. And so, baby, we're going to have 8% blacks in this freshman class if we got to go and no matter what we have to do to get them. Because it's the dissociation from the stigma that is so necessary to the legitimacy of the institution. 1970s, the early 70s, we began to practice a welfare in America, where we basically said to people, this was coming out of the welfare rights movement and coming out of the civil rights movement, we basically said to people, okay, we'll give you a little bit better than subsistence living and you don't have to do anything at all. Nothing. Don't have to educate yourself or your children. Don't be married. In fact, you can't be married. You can't have a whole family. And if your children grow up and they have children, then of course we'll put them on the dole too. And they too don't have to do anything. So it's one of these odd situations where you actually put an incentive in place for human inertia. You get rewarded for being nothing, for doing nothing. Nothing, you get rewarded for, in a sense, giving up your humanity. Well, what kind of society, other than one trying to dissociate from the stigma of racism, one other acting guilty, would put in place a policy like that?
Family, I went further to do my own research on why white guilt has affected the promise of civilization and the civil rights. Here is a deeper dive onto Shelby Steele's theory that white guilt is destroying the promise of civilization and civil rights. His argument is not just social commentary, it's a sweeping critique of the moral, political, and psychological shifts in the Western democracies since the civil rights era. The first thing that you want to discuss about is the psychological power shift after the 1960s. Shelby Steele believes that the civil rights victories of the 1960s, like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, didn't empower black Americans in the way most people think. Instead, they caused a massive shift in moral authority. White institutions lost moral confidence, while black Americans gained moral leverage, not through power, but by being seen as victims. When you win freedom through the moral disgrace of others, your power is deprived from their guilt, not your strength. And that is exactly what happened in that timing. White guilt have since been used, as a tool of corruption. Somebody would ask me, how is white guilt being used as a tool of corruption? Steele, in his speech, argues that white guilt corrupted institutions. Look at schools. Schools lowered standards the great inflation, the relaxed discipline. When you look at corporations, they embraced performative diversity instead of real competence. When you look at the media and universities, they are regarded grievance, identity over merit. These were not acts of justice. Still says they are acts of self-exoneration. White guilt is not real guilt. It's a way to disassociate from racism without doing anything truly transformative. You know, you want to say that you're not racist, that you have black friends. You know, that is how you know that somebody has a lot of white guilt. They do not want to be transformative. They want to disassociate with the fact that their history is embedded in making other people feel lesser, being racist to other people. It leads to symbolic gestures rather than real solutions. Protests, hashtag diversity officers, you know, without changing the material conditions of lives of black Americans. Then there's civil rights movement from freedom to victimhood. Still honors the courage of the early civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., but he critiques what came after. Post-1960s activism shifted from demanding equal rights to demanding special entitlements. Race became a political weapon, not a human identity. You know, identity politics fragmented the nation's common values, and now people started thinking about freedom, equality, and self-responsibility. The tragedy is that we traded the glory of freedom for the currency of victimization. Then many people are asking, how is then white guilt, you know, destroying the promise of civilization? Shelby tries to use civilization. Shelby says that civilization refers to the Western Enlightenment values, the reasoned rule of law, liberty, and merit. White guilt lead to moral appeasement rather than truth-telling, censorship rather than honest debate, dependency rather than empowerment. This undermines the core promise of modern civilization that every individual, regardless of their race, should rise or fall by the content of their character and the strength of their choices. Then what is the solution? You know, according to Still, he says that he believes that people should return, you know, to individualism. Still doesn't believe black people are inherently disadvantaged. He believes the narrative of victimhood and disempowered them. We are not victims, we are free. And we have the same agency as anyone else. That is true legacy of the civil rights movement. He calls for ending race-based policies, focusing on personal responsibility, and encouraging moral courage, even if it's unpopular. To Still, white guilt is not a noble act of atonement. It's a moral vacuum, a weakness that allows entire systems to drift away from the truth, excellence, and justice. Rather than lifting up the oppressed, white guilt keeps both whites and black trapped, one in fear, the other in dependency. Family, let me know in the comment section what you think about white guilt. You know, for me, I think that this was a very, very insightful topic by Still, and it's one that I'd actually wish that you can share with your friends and family so that we can be able to learn together. Kindly like this video so that it can be recommended to other YouTube users. Last but not least, kindly do consider subscribing to the channel. We are currently on the road to 50,000 subs, and guys, we can never do this without your support. Thank you, and see you all in our next episode. Goodbye for now.